Hey everyone, this is a recording of Kant and Cosmopolitan Legacies by Garrett W. Brown. This is from the Routledge International Handbook of Cosmopolitanism Studies, or on Cosmopolitanism Studies. I can't remember the specific title. But this is kind of a reference material, for one, because I personally don't know much about Immanuel Kant, and two, I've become increasingly interested in the concept of cosmopolitanism, and so yeah, I'm gonna be uploading a bunch of different videos from this thing just to get a better feel on for this concept. Anyway, the legacy of Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, on cosmopolitan thought is profound. This is because it would be near impossible to find a discussion within contemporary cosmopolitanism that did not make protracted and direct references to the political philosophy of Kant. Whether one is in agreement with Kant's cosmopolitan vision or not, his works have undoubtedly had a lasting and deeply penetrating influence on cosmopolitans and anti-cosmopolitans alike. Moreover, the Kantian cosmopolitan legacy has continued to transcend the confines of traditional political philosophy, inspiring scholars in disciplines as diverse as anthropology, development, economics, geography, international relations, law, political science, and sociology. In light of Kant's importance within cosmopolitan thought, it is fitting that the International Handbook of Cosmopolitan Studies has a dedicated chapter entirely to Kant's cosmopolitan vision. Accordingly, the purpose of this chapter is to present some of the key features of Kantian cosmopolitanism, as well as to advance and clarify a number of Kant's positions as they relate to ongoing cosmopolitan criticisms. To do so, the chapter is divided into 4 sections. Kantian cosmopolitanism will outline the general moral and legal elements that underwrites Kant's cosmopolitanism. From this basic vision, the section Kant's anti-imperialist cosmopolitanism examines and then refutes the claim that Kant's cosmopolitanism should be understood as promoting a kind of imperialism. Building upon this discussion, Kantian laws of hospitality and the broadening of public right will examine Kant's laws of hospitality in further detail, illustrating how Kant demands clear protections against imperialism as well as the protection of visiting strangers, whether as refugees or in attempts to establish mutual relations. Lastly, the chapter ends by reflecting on Kant's place within contemporary thinking, suggesting that Kantian cosmopolitanism continues to offer meaningful insights, thus remaining heuristically salient for ongoing debates concerning species life and global cohabitation. Kantian cosmopolitanism. Although the history of cosmopolitan thought has been argued to date as far back as the philosopher Anneton in 1526 BC, according to Harris, published in 1927, there is a considerable consensus that history's most formidable influence upon cosmopolitan thought came from the political philosophy of Kant, Nussbaum, 1997. This is because, unlike his predecessors, Kant offered a more nuanced, extended, and practically oriented form of cosmopolitanism, which reached far beyond the existing ethical, religious, and legal ideas of his time. In its most basic form, Kant's cosmopolitanism concerns itself with delineating the moral, legal, and political conditions required to establish a condition of cosmopolitan right, a condition of justice, mutually consistent external freedom between all global inhabitants. As Kant argues in the Critique of Pure Reason, what is required to ground this condition is, quote, a constitution allowing the greatest possible human freedom in accordance with laws which ensure that the freedom of each can coexist with the freedom of all the others, end quote. Establishing a condition of public right, according to Kant, quote, is at all events a necessary idea which must be made the basis of not only the first outline of a political constitution, but all laws as well." End quote. Kant. What Kant is suggesting is that external freedom, independence from being constrained solely by another's choice, is only fully possible if it is also grounded and mutually recognized under a universal system of law where one's freedom, quote, "can coexist with the freedom of every other," end quote. It is only under such a condition of public right that the, quote, "choice of one can be united with the choice of another in accordance with the universal law of freedom," end quote. Kant. The moral foundations underpinning Kant's concern with establishing this condition of external freedom and public right derive from two of his more notable contributions to moral philosophy. The first of these Kantian contributions begins with the deployment of his transcendental deduction and the assumption that humans have the ability for free will. According to Kant, it is impossible to empirically prove whether or not free will truly exists. For Kant, what is more important is whether free will can be understood to exist transcendentally. Through a method of deduction, Kant suggests that humans often make judgments claiming that someone ought to have acted in a certain way or that someone should have behaved differently. By making such demands in our everyday practice, humans already make a series of assumptions about people having the ability to have done something otherwise. Thus, they have a level of free will available to them to make or to not make a moral decision. As Kant furthers, if humans are not free to determine the imperative force behind moral values, a world without free will would intimate, then morality no longer represents a self-imposed moral duty, but a coerced determinant that no longer requires appeals to morality. This is troubling for Kant, since the capacity to self-legislate is a priori, the power to be a moral being, and as a result must be understood to represent the ultimate source of human dignity. As Kant argues, by acting in accordance with moral principles prescribed by one's own reason, humans assert their independence from an empirically determined world of coercion, and in doing so establish what is distinctively human and unique about our nature. However, Kant also understands that if moral choice is what makes us distinctively human, then those moral choices will also stand in relation to the free choices of other humans. If this is so, argues Kant, then to uphold free will as the ultimate source of human dignity will also require that one's freedom is also universally valid in relation to the external freedom of all others. This is true both internally in regards to a condition of domestic public right, but also in regards to relations between states and peoples, international and cosmopolitan public right. In understanding that humans should not submit to a morality outside them, Kant demands that humans must always be understood as co-legislating members of a universal kingdom of ends. To state differently, once everyone has the capacity to be moral lawgivers, it is therefore rational to treat others with basic moral respect, to understand other people's capacity for free will, and to behave with a corresponding awareness of our universal human dignity. It is from this underwriting notion of universal validity that Kant posits his categorical imperative, which insists that we should, quote, act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, end quote. In respect for the dignity of moral choice, Kant further derives from this maxim that we should, quote, act in such a way as that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, and never only as a means, end quote. Kant stresses the importance of this imperative as the foundation of law and politics when he argues that it represents, quote, an original right belonging to every man by virtue of his humanity, end quote. It is because external freedom requires co-legislation within a universal kingdom of ends that Kant thus maintains the judicial need for a cosmopolitan constitution that can allow, quote, the greatest possible human freedom in accordance with laws which ensure that the freedom of each can coexist with the freedom of all the others, end quote. As stated previously, Kant holds that establishing this condition of public right, quote, is at all events a necessary idea which must be made the basis of not only the first outline of a political constitution, but all laws as well, end quote. Kant. Although Kant provides the moral groundings for why a condition of cosmopolitan right is, quote, necessary, end quote, he also suggests that establishing this cosmopolitan condition does not need to rely on these, quote, motives of morality, end quote, alone, since there are also persistent rational and practical incentives embedded within existing global relations. For Kant, the motivational basis for cosmopolitan right is premised on, one moment, for Kant, the motivational basis for cosmopolitan right is premised on many of the similar empirical justifications commonly highlighted by contemporary cosmopolitans as they pertain to globalization. Like many contemporary cosmopolitans, Kant argues that the world has become increasingly interconnected, where human interaction is no longer unavoidable, and where, quote, a violation of right in one part of the world is felt everywhere, end quote. Kant suggests that due to the profound empirical and moral implications of global interconnectedness and interdependency and its potential to harm mutually consistent public right, the, quote, greatest problem for the human species is that of attaining a civil society which can administer justice universally, end quote. Kant. What is required in the immediate sense, according to Kant, is the creation of mutually consistent international and cosmopolitan principles, quote, which may eventually be regulated by public laws, thus bringing the human race nearer and nearer to a cosmopolitan constitution, end quote. As a transitional mechanism, Kant claims that the legal grounding for cosmopolitan public rights should be applied through a tripartite system of interlocking and mutually reinforcing laws. Brown, 2009. In the first instance, this was to be fostered and expanded through a voluntary Pacific Federation of like-minded republican states and peoples who are dedicated to the establishment of a more rightful condition under cosmopolitan law. This tripartite matrix of cosmopolitan law would codify public right into domestic law / domestic right, laws between citizens, international law / international right, laws between states and other political units, and the creation of cosmopolitan law / cosmopolitan right, laws between states and individuals, especially non-citizens, including laws between private individuals. As a means for cosmopolitical expansion, Kant suggests that this cosmopolitan legal matrix might develop from, quote, one powerful and enlightened nation, a republic, end quote, of public right, and that this could, quote, provide a focal point for federal association among other states, end quote. Kant goes on to suggest that other states could, quote, join up with the first one, thus securing the freedom of each state in accordance with the idea of international right. And the whole will gradually spread further and further by a series of alliances of this kind, end quote. Moreover, the empirical dynamics of globalization, which are rooted within the political and economic structures of the international system, furnish opportunities for normative reflectivity that provides the impetus for states, even against their immediate self-interest, towards producing the potential, quote, concord among men, end quote, Kant. As Kant suggests, this reflective logic can rely solely on practical realities of mutual interest in trade and security, which, if not addressed, can, quote, provide the occasion for troubles in one place on the globe to be felt all over, end quote. It is in relation to minimizing the cost of these potential harms that Kant believes that, quote, the first articles of alliance, end quote, will be those associated with trade and security, and it is from this impetus that cosmopolitanism is not only motivationally possible, but also empirically and normatively necessary. In other words, what Kant is suggesting is that any state constitution and civil order, no matter how internally coherent and stable, cannot be fully secure unless its external relationships with other states are also mutually secure, and that this can only be done through meaningful political cooperation and the acceptance of a genuine system of public right between states and peoples. Therefore, for Kant, international stability and the health of a state's own civil order is inextricably interconnected. Because of this, Kant puts forward, quote, wherever in the world there is a threat, states will be motivated to prevent that threat by mediation, end quote, Kant. It is through this mediation and the continued promotion of a tripartite system, public right, from which Kant suggests states will increasingly reduce wars of insecurity, moving ever slowly, incrementally toward what he famously labeled a condition of perpetual peace. Kant's anti-imperialist cosmopolitanism. At first glance, Kant's cosmopolitan vision seems rather ideal. This is because it is hard to intuitively argue against its most basic premise, namely the creation of a copacetic world of mutually respectful cohabitation. However, critics of Kant and cosmopolitanism do not share this view. They have often suggested that Kant's vision actually obscures an insidious form of power and dominance by dressing it up in universalist clothes. According to critics, Kant's cosmopolitanism actually gives license to an authoritarian, quote, nightmarish hegemony, end quote, associated with the eventual establishment of a world government. White, 1987. Which is inherently racist. Bernasconi, 2011, and which is implicitly Eurocentric, culturally insensitive, and fundamentally imperialist in nature. Tully, 2008. In many ways, these critiques have not done justice to Kant's more mature articulation of cosmopolitanism, nor do these critiques offer Kant any leeway to have changed his position in the later years of his life. Yet there are explanations for why confusion and contention exist. This is because many of Kant's ideas are at times in opposition to each other, and there are a number of cases where Kant's ideas remain underdeveloped or ambiguous in comparison to other aspects of his work. This is compounded by the fact that Kant's cosmopolitan writings came toward the very end of his life, with Kant himself proclaiming that he was unable to fully complete his thoughts, while also encouraging his readers to finish his cosmopolitan project for him. It is in this spirit that it is useful to respond to three of Kant's most serious criticisms. Doing so not only helps to refute these charges against him, but also helps to refine and explore the complexities of Kant's broader cosmopolitan vision. As briefly outlined above, a lasting critique of Kant's legacy argues that a cosmopolitan condition or of public right would ultimately require enforcement from a state-like entity with the final authority to mitigate any violations of public right. If instituted along these lines, this legal structure would eliminate our existing understanding of state sovereignty and national self-determination, thus creating a homogeneous and hegemonic world state from which there would be no escape from its unifying tyranny. As Hedley Bull has written, Kantian, quote, imperatives enjoy not coexistence and cooperation among states, but rather the overthrow of the system of states and its replacement by a cosmopolitan society, end quote. Some Kantian scholars have also endorsed a similar interpretation, maintaining that the Kantian ideal theory requires individuals to live under common civil laws of a cosmopolitan republic, and that Kant's final idea of federation was merely his second best ideal. Although Kant scholars remain divided on whether Kant should or should not have advocated for a world state, there is general consensus that Kant ultimately argues against the formation of a world state, opting instead for what he calls a Pacific federation. Furthermore, Kant is clear that the federation is to be a voluntary, progressively expanding association of free and independent states. As the exegetical evidence supports, Kant also dismissed a world state as dangerous to external freedom and expressed concerns about its unbridled despotism. As Kant proclaimed, quote, such a world state is in turn even more dangerous to freedom, for that world state may lead to fearful despotism. Distrust must force men to form an order which is not a cosmopolitan commonwealth under a single ruler, but a lawful federation under a commonly accepted international right, end quote. Kant adds, quote, this federation does not aim to acquire any power like that of a state, but merely to preserve and secure the freedom of each state in itself, along with that of the other confederated states, end quote. Kant. The most plausible interpretation of these statements is that Kant did indeed favor a federation for practical and empirical reasons, but also believed that something more than a basic federation was needed to fulfill the ultimate cosmopolitan ideal of public right. In this way, it might be best to argue that Kant saw a global federation as an evolutionary stage towards a more robust form of future global governance. Cavalier, 1999. Yet, unlike the world state reading, Kant did not advocate for a world state, but was only optimistic about a future movement towards a broader cosmopolitan political order of some kind yet to be determined. The most persuasive aspect of this interpretation is that it is able to maintain Kant's firm stance that any movement towards transnational or global institutions would be voluntary and unforced. Thus, it is possible to understand that Kant had profound concerns about the formation of a world republic, while also understanding that given the right conditions, the establishment of voluntary transnational cosmopolitan institutions is not ruled out. Importantly, however, this political order would have to be consistent with Kantian principles of external freedom and public right, for it is clear that the establishment of these institutions could only be justified on Kantian grounds if there were also guarantees that individual freedoms would not be threatened by a possible despotic world order. A second criticism of Kant focuses on his works prior to 1790 and his explicitly racist defenses of the white race, its superiority over other races, Kant's clear disdain for racial mixing, and his ambivalent support for slavery. As a leading voice against Kant, Robert Bernasconi has argued that Kant's early views on race taint and implicitly pollute his political philosophy more generally, thus undermining the sincerity in which Kant assigns universal dignity to human beings. The immediate implication for Kant, argues Bernasconi, is questioning the sincerity of Kant's cosmopolitanism. It would be hard for any cosmopolitan to defend the racial arguments of Kant or to convincingly justify Kant's scientific racism as located in writings such as Determination of the Concept of a Human Race. Nevertheless, it is important to observe that Kant seemingly had a change of mind sometime shortly after 1790, like with his change of mind away from his earlier advocacy for a world state. Kant's position on race also notably changed after 1790. As Pauline Kleingeld has convincingly argued, Kant's, quote, texts display a chronological pattern indicating that Kant radically changed his views on colonialism in the mid-1970s, end quote, and that this, quote, closely related to his changing views of race, end quote. If this holds, which the evidence supports, then the question becomes, in what way did Kant become anti-imperialist, and in what ways is this manifest in his outlines for a cosmopolitan public right? The question will be addressed in the Kant and the Future of Collective Action Problems section. Yet, there is still more to be said on the matter here. Related to the above concern, a third critique of Kant argues that his teleological assumptions about inevitable human progress equates to nothing more than a European civilizing mission where the success of human progress becomes measured solely against European and Enlightenment ideas regarding what constitutes the most legitimate form of culture, politics, and law. As James Tully has argued, Kant's vision presents an overly, quote, Eurocentric narrative of historical development as the universally necessary and irresistible path of development and modernization, end quote. James Tully, 2008. As with Kant's views on race and culture, there is sizable exegetical evidence to suggest that Kant's early views on imperialism were at best ambivalent in that he often posited teleological theory that presupposed a hierarchy of culture and As with Kant's views on race and culture, there is sizable exegetical evidence to suggest that Kant's early views on imperialism were at best ambivalent, and that he often posited teleological theory that presupposed a hierarchy of culture, politics, and law, with Europe sitting firmly atop this pyramid. In addition, there are also a number of passages in Kant's early works to suggest that his idea of history with a cosmopolitan purpose would be one in which European Enlightenment signaled an end of history. Yet again, like his views on race, the need for a world state, and his views on European teleological exceptionalism, Kant demonstrably counters his earlier positions after 1790, particularly when developing his political philosophy and cosmopolitanism. In terms of his anti-imperialism in both the Metaphysics of Morals and Perpetual Peace, Kant presents a clear assault on the commercial exploits of the large trading nations. Kant proclaims that these European nations have, quote, led to oppression of the natives, incitement of various Indian states to widespread wars, famine, insurrection, treachery, and the whole litany of evils which can afflict the human race, end quote. Kant. Kant furthers his critique on imperialism, stating that, quote, inhospitable conduct of the civilized states of our continent, especially the commercial states, the injustices which they display in visiting foreign countries and peoples, which in their case is the same as conquering them, seems appallingly great, end quote. It was because of the, quote, evils, end quote, of European imperial practice that Kant endorsed China's and Japan's attempt to limit European contact as a reasonable precaution against European hostilities. In this light, Kant's hospitality cannot be seen as a clear endorsement of imperialism. As will be outlined in detail below, this condemnation of imperialism fits nicely with his overall demand to create a mutually consistent condition of public right. What is necessary, argues Kant, are laws of hospitality that, quote, make it possible for individuals to enter into relations, end quote, with each other. For it is only through a base level of mutual consistency that it then becomes possible for, quote, continents distant from each other, end quote, to, quote, enter into peaceful mutual relations which may eventually be regulated by public law, thus bringing the human race nearer and nearer to a cosmopolitan constitution, end quote. Kant. Kantian laws of hospitality and the broadening of public right. Although a full discussion of Kant's cosmopolitan public right cannot be fully developed here, it is useful to outline 5 laws of hospitality that can be derived from Kant's wider discussions on cosmopolitan law. In its basic form, the laws of hospitality concern the, quote, right of a stranger not to be treated with hostility when that stranger arrives on someone else's territory, end quote. However, this principle of hospitality goes beyond the protection of basic freedoms as is often claimed, for example, by Derrida and Brown. This is because Kant subtly elaborates on what a commitment to cosmopolitan hospitality demands by alluding to additional principles of cosmopolitan hospitality that should affect all global interactions between peoples, which generate a series of positive duties to all humans. First, all human beings have a right to exist. First of all human beings have a right to exit, enter, and travel. As Kant suggests, there is a right of citizens of the world to try to establish community with all, and to that end to visit all regions of the earth. Secondly, all human beings should have a freedom from hostility and from negligence that would result in imminent harm to body or property. This is an important measure of hospitality that will be discussed further below, for it protects individuals not only from direct harm, but also stipulates that a host community cannot turn individuals away if there is a possibility that this action will result in death or immediate harm to person and property. Thirdly, all human beings should have the freedom of communication and to engage in debates of public reason. This represents the Kantian belief that it is only through dialogue, exchange, and, quote, the freedom to make public use of one's reason, end quote, that broader social change and global civil advancement can hope to be achieved over time. Fourthly, all humans should have the freedom to engage in commerce and the use of the world in common. As Kant suggests, quote, humans stand in a community of possible interaction, that is, in a thoroughgoing relation of each to all the others of offering to engage in commerce and with any other, and each has the right to make this attempt, end quote. Kant. Lastly, all humans should have freedom from false, misrepresented, extorted, or fraudulent contracts. As Kant states in relation to international business dealings, settlement, and legal contract, the law of hospitality demands that these interactions, quote, may not take place by force but only by contract, and indeed by a contract that does not take advantage of the ignorance of those inhabitants, end quote. Kant. What is interesting about Kant's final 2 laws are the explicitly anti-imperialist positioning, and that they demand that all dealings with peoples, regardless of affiliation, must be negotiated in good faith and in such a way that resulting conditions are seen as mutually consistent. Although this represents a very minimal form of cosmopolitan right, a strong commitment to these final laws would go some way to correct the inequalities involved in the global market, while also creating a greater sense of fairness, cooperation, mutual right, and even-handedness at the global level. This outline above sits much easier with Kant's notion of public right, since hospitality can be seen to represent those conditions which make it possible for people to enter into peaceful relations with each other, so that this may eventually bring, quote, the human race nearer and nearer to a cosmopolitan constitution, end quote. These laws represent the basic legal mechanisms for humans peaceably to trade, associate, communicate, exchange ideas without mistreatment, and engage commercially with one another under a mutually consistent conception of hospitality. In line with Kant's broader idea of free will and self-law-giving, the laws of hospitality did not immediately create a full condition of global justice, as many contemporary cosmopolitans would wish, but a minimal condition of external freedom, so that individuals have the opportunity to, quote, engage in the use of public reason, end quote, and to relate ethically toward one another to the point where critical distinctions and tensions would disintegrate over time. In addition, this reading of hospitality also fits nicely with Kant's idea of both personal and communal enlightenment. For the laws of hospitality not only, quote, provide important guarantees for the security and property of persons, but more importantly, it creates sufficient safety for them to proceed to perfect their moral lives, end quote. Linklater, 1990. As Kant maintains, these exchanges must be guaranteed and fostered at the global level, because it will only be through public reason and global deliberation that a future cosmopolitan condition might be obtained through self-legislation in relation to others. For this reason, Kant demands that, quote, these rights must be held sacred. There are no half measures here, for all politics must bend the knee before right, if politics may hope to arrive, however slowly, at a stage of lasting brilliance, end quote. Kant. Nevertheless, Kant's laws of hospitality should be seen as multi-directional, in that Kant's laws of hospitality apply not only to foreign relations as visiting agents, but also in relation to when one is visited. In particular, Kant offers detailed discussion of what is involved in having a cosmopolitan right to asylum. For Kant clearly states within Perpetual Peace that an individual cannot, quote, be, quote, turned away, end quote, if this could not be done, quote, without causing his death, end quote. In addition, Kant broadens the possible parameters involved with asylum by arguing that individuals should be free from, quote, inhospitable conduct, end quote, that would result in imminent harm to body or property. This inhospitable conduct includes the, quote, enslaving of stranded seafarers, end quote. The, quote, plundering of property, end quote. Slavery for repayment of debt, causing starvation or, quote, famine, end quote. Quote, treachery, end quote. Quote, physical violence, end quote. And or allowing actions that would immediately cause significant harm to body and property. Kant. In this regard, Kant has broadened the reasons that one could claim a right to asylum, which includes cases where an individual will suffer imminent harm as a result of their deportation or refoulement. Hope I'm pronouncing that right, probably not. In this case, xenophobic claims regarding the possible rejection of asylum seekers under Kantian hospitality are not as evident as critics like Derrida suggest. Since Kantian hospitality strictly forbids rejection if death or imminent harm to body or property would be the result of such expulsion. Since in many cases asylum seekers and refugees face torture, starvation, and death if deported, it should be argued that these deportations and refoulements would be tantamount to, quote, inhospitable conduct, end quote. Therefore, contemporaneously, failures of the refugee crisis can be seen under Kantian cosmopolitanism as a negligent violation of the laws of hospitality, and thus remains available to recent debates about collective responsibility for those who wash onto our shores. Final section. Kant and the future of collective action problems. It is hard to overstate the influence Kant has had on cosmopolitan and anti-cosmopolitan. One second. Excuse me. Sorry. Something popped up on my screen. It is hard to overstate the influence Kant has had on cosmopolitan and anti-cosmopolitan thought, Rightly or wrongly, Kant has often been credited with positively grounding our modern conception of universal human rights. Follisdale and Malix, 2014, for providing a political blueprint for the establishment of the European Union. Delanty, 2005, Brown, 2014, with promoting modern liberal conceptions of democratic legitimacy. Held, 1995, and for highlighting how, quote, properly constituted, end quote, democratic states create a condition of democratic peace between nations. Doyle, 1983. Negatively, Kant has also been simultaneously blamed for single-handedly inventing the concept of race and its negative outcomes. Bernasconi, 2001, for philosophically underwriting an unyielding globalization of exploitation. Harvey, 2009, and for providing the philosophical firepower necessary for Enlightenment's aim toward, quote, world conquest, end quote. White, 1987. Although some of these critiques are unfair because they lump Kant's philosophy in with a whole host of sins associated with Enlightenment thinking and its more negative after effects, it would also be churlish to ignore these critiques without offering a thoroughgoing response. Unfortunately, the space available in this chapter did not provide such an opportunity. Nevertheless, the hope is that it at least provided some insights to make sense of Kant's more contradictory aspects, while also providing a holistic overview of a defensible reading of Kantian cosmopolitanism. Having understood the practical limitations of moving his universal moral theory to universal practice, Kant consciously pursued a more humble and moderate course than his critics give him credit. As Kant states, a cosmopolitan condition will be the result of international norm building and a continued enthusiasm, so that these narrowest of ethical conditions will, quote, gradually spread further and further, end quote. In this regard, Kant seemingly wished to avoid making predictions as to the final institutional complexion of a cosmopolitan condition. For Kant, what is first needed and what is critical for any advancement of institutional cosmopolitanism are basic laws of hospitality that can help cultivate a broad sense of shared community, where everyone is considered as if they could be mutual citizens of the world. Although Kant was aware that current political hindrances often restrict relations between peoples, he also insisted that, quote, this possible abuse cannot annul the right of citizens of the world to try and establish community with all, end quote. As Kant forcefully proclaimed, hospitable treatment is not merely a philanthropic principle, but a, quote, principle having to do with public right, end quote. And this is, according to Kant, quote, a necessary complement to the unwritten code of political and international right, transforming it into a universal right of humanity, end quote. Kant. It is arguable that the need to establish this cosmopolitan universal right of humanity has become more urgent today than it was in 1795. This reflection becomes particularly salient in the face of increasing global collective action problems and the potential calamitous effects of climate change, nuclear proliferation, global disease risk, growing global inequalities, resource depletion, global financial crisis, the ongoing refugee crisis, and a resurgent national parochialism that is seemingly moving global relations in the opposite direction.